Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're in James chapter 5. James chapter 5, and we're talking about this. The first half of the chapter, at least the first 6 verses, he deals with what audience of people? It's very specifically who and let me rephrase my question. In the first 6 verses of chapter 5, the rich, okay, the rich. He's talking about the rich, and especially those rich who have defrauded and oppressed and created difficulties for others. He addressed them very specifically and the consequences and judgments that's going to come because of them. That was our discussion Wednesday evening. We talked about that aspect, and we slowly migrated Wednesday night into a discussion then about how all those who are dealing with those oppressions and difficulties and challenges, how patience and forbearance through those difficulties is necessary to work through. And so that's that be patient statement that begins in verse 7 that we began to talk about. And we discussed a little bit Wednesday about this phrase, coming of the Lord, that's stated there in verse 8. I'll come back to that before we kind of, that's where we'll kind of come back to here in just a minute in our discussion, because I didn't give you one of those deals again where our class is ending, I throw a thought and don't give you any chance to digest it or think about it or ask anything related to it, and class was over. So I want to come back to that, verse 8, here in just a moment, in this context that really begins in verse 7. But before we go any further in our study, if you would, let's bow our heads together, sharing a word of prayer before we start. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the day that you've given us. Thank you for the benefit of your testimony and your word. Help us to recognize that your judgment is real and that you have brought judgments against circumstances and nations and people who have defied your purposes and your will, and in particular that have oppressed and challenged others in this life. Help us to glean appreciation for your testimony this morning through the writer James. Help us to learn and use the knowledge that we gain today. Thank you for all the good that comes from your hands, and we pray all these things through thy Son's name. Amen. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this, right? Because he tells this second audience, right? First audience is the rich who've been causing all the rich or oppressions and challenges. Then the audience becomes those who've been kind of stuck in those difficulties and hardships that have been created. And the very first thing he tells them to do is be what? Be patient. Easy or hard to do? Hard to do for most people. There are a handful of people I've met in my life that are as patient as the day is long, and it baffles my mind how they're able to do it, right? Because they just seemingly have an ability to have a fortitude about them that is very patient and long-suffering and forbearing through things that would frustrate the daylights out of me pretty quickly. And so I have great respect for people who maybe don't have to work at it as hard as others. But the truth of the matter is, most of us are challenged by the idea of being patient, particularly when those challenges that are troubling me are real and they're not trivial. And they're things that are troublesome in very, very serious ways. Now, let's make the connectivity. We talked Wednesday night a little bit about the fact that if you were to sit down and read the book of James, you could probably do it in 10, 15 minutes, right? And they would kind of digest the letters that way. They wouldn't parse it out like we do into chapters and verses and minute thoughts. They would look at the whole picture. And really, verse 7, when he starts talking to this side of the audience, is very similar to the things that he was saying in the very beginning of the letter, right? When he said, count it all joy when you fall into what? Diverse temptations and challenges, right? Because the working of your faith worketh patience, right? There's the theme again. And so I'm just trying to remind you that James really hasn't deviated a whole lot from the thematic kind of approach to what he's trying to encourage these folks to do. And he does what good writing does in some ways. He introduces a theme in the very beginning, and as he begins to wrap up, what's he do? He comes back. He comes back and reestablishes what the intent and purposes of some of the things he's been saying throughout this letter are. And so here's this messaging to be patient, just like the fellow that plants a vineyard, he's got to be patient for the fruit, the crop to produce. And you can't plant one day and expect what? Yeah, the crop's the next, right? You have to be patient through that process. And then there was this secondary reason to be patient noted in verse 8. That's where we kind of left off on Wednesday. And that is when he said, also be patient and establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. And we talked about the fact that when you see that phrase, coming of the Lord, if we say it fast and think about it fast, where's our mind generally go? Well, I'm talking about the coming of the Lord. Judgment, the ultimate end time judgment, right? That judgment that comes at the resurrection of Jesus, that's our minds generally jump there. But we talked Wednesday that this phrase, coming of the Lord, is used throughout the Scriptures to not simply only refer to that ultimate judgment when man stands before the judgment seat of Christ and will be judged according to the things that he's done in his body, right? There are those kinds of conversations. But sometimes it just means the coming of the judgment of the Lord. And that judgment may come more immediate. How's it described in terms of its timing in verse 8? It's drawing nigh. How many years ago was this written? Roughly, right? Roughly 2,000 years, and has final judgment. I'm not trying to insult you here, right? No, right? No, we're still here. The earth is still here. It hasn't melted away with fervent heat. Hasn't done any things that you talk about when it comes to that final judgment. And my point, friends, is simply this. That's why I believe that James is not talking about the ultimate final judgment when all men stand before the judgment seat of Christ. I believe James is addressing the fact that God is coming to deal with this situation he's been discussing here. Same kind of language you see in what book? And we referenced this Wednesday. Book of Revelation, right? In the book of Revelation, you see similar kinds of things. The very beginning of the book of Revelation, he says, these are the things that must soon come to pass, right? He doesn't say these are things that are going to come centuries and centuries later. He said these are things that are going to soon come to pass in the beginning of the book of Revelation. And then he begins to talk about judgments that Christ can bring over the oppressors of his people. I argue the same similar thought is happening here in the book of James. It doesn't mean it can't have some general application towards the end judgment. Right? There's things we could glean from it that might help us appreciate what to do in light of that ultimate coming judgment. But I really think he's dealing with what God is imminently going to do in addressing this problem that is before them. That's the planted seed I threw at you Wednesday. Give you a chance to think about that. So thoughts, your questions, different ideas about what James might be addressing here.
I just think that this is such an encouragement to them. I mean, you might take him telling them to be patient as, well, just be patient. But to me, those are words of encouragement of, don't let go, don't turn into these people, don't do the things that they're doing, just keep going. You're doing, do what you're doing.
Right, and I appreciate that, right? Because that's the sentiment of be patient. Well, why? Because the Lord isn't blind to these things. And God is witnessing and seeing the various actions of others. And it may not happen on our timetable, but God does bring judgment over these things. And I am encouraged by knowing that it doesn't take end times and it doesn't take miracle for God to purposely function in the world that he created, and even bringing judgment against the oppressors and those who create challenges and harm towards the weak, and those who are defenseless. And we mentioned Wednesday, that is a recurring theme throughout Scripture. I'd argue that is one of the, if you're going to create a hierarchy list, one of the top things that God repeatedly brings judgment against people about is when they're oppressing and causing harm to others. It's a repeated theme throughout Scripture when God brings judgment. Go ahead, Jeff.
Again, we can look at the example of AD 70, what happened in Jerusalem. That's when the Lord brought his judgment upon them. That's another example of the day of the Lord.
Right, he was willing to do that even against his own people that he had chosen because of the consequence and oppression they were bringing to others, and to resolve that.
More generically, the Bible's been here for a very long time, and every person that reads that, our life is short. It is nigh, no matter how you look at it, to you when you read it, because we don't live hundreds and thousands of years.
Yeah.
So it still applies.
Yeah, and I agree with you.
Read the verse.
Yeah, I agree that side of the application process of the book of James is fair, because we can learn and appreciate that maybe James is dealing with a very specific kind of situation that God's going to render some judgment about, but it does educate us about the fact that there is judgment coming to everybody ultimately, and life is short in preparing for those moments. And so the general applications are certainly beneficial. Absolutely, yeah. Any other? Go ahead, Bonnie.
I mean, of course, he uses a farming thing there as an example, but, reaping what you sow. That is, that's a judgment from God, too.
Sure. And sometimes the consequences that come to man, and the hand of God may be behind it in the sense of how things are ordered, but the consequence comes because of their own choices and behaviors. You know what I mean? How God has set the sowing and reaping process in order by nature brings its own consequences at times because of the choices and behaviors of people and the difficulties they create for themselves.
Well, even in the Old Testament, it shows that, the
Yeah.
cause and effect.
Yeah. Good thought. Any more? Okay. So let's turn to thoughts. So verse 9 then, grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth before the door. Okay. Rich folks that are oppressing and defrauding the laborers, getting rich on the backs of others without any respect towards that, be warned, judgment's coming, right? That's the first thought. Those who have been challenged by those things, be patient. The Lord can bring judgment and is bringing judgment. It's nigh. In the meantime, while you're being patient, don't do what, verse 9? Yeah, don't start fussing at one another through this process. Don't grudge not one against another, brethren, lest you be condemned. It was kind of alluded to by somebody a little bit ago in our discussion. Part of the patience process is making sure that I don't get pulled into the same behaviors that God is ultimately going to bring consequence and judgment about. I've got to be careful that even when others misbehave, it doesn't tempt me to what? Yeah, retaliate in kind, right? That's the common response to the bad behaviors of others. Is the common response often is to behave in the exact same way. I've often found it comical, if that's a fair word. A stronger term would be I find it hypocritical at times. How folks will, in various discussions and arguments, will take the very same argument one side made and condemn it. But when it fits their narrative, they'll turn around and use the very same argument to defend. So condemned in one, embraced in another, and the inconsistency of that is mind-boggling to me. And the fact that folks can't see it. What's my point? My point is, that's the fear that James has when he writes this. That when you condemn an audience of people, the temptation might be to start, well, see, James, boy, he really hit those guys, and then we start behaving like they behaved back towards them. And James says, that's not my intent here. My intent is not to get you to start warfare against those you believe who's oppressing and those who've been oppressed. I'm telling you, in fact, the opposite, James says in verse 9. I don't want you to grudge against another, because you'll just bring condemnation to yourself in the process. Behold, the judge standeth before the door. Be careful, he said. Well, let me pause. Who's the judge in verse 9? I should ask that question. Okay, could be Jesus. Anybody notice anything about the manner in which it's typed? That's right. Okay, it's got a slower case J. And when you see that, generally that might indicate that we're not referring to whom? To God or Jesus, right? Generally, when you see something divine, and you'll see some kind of indicator that any other thought you might. I'm trying not to just give it to you. I'm trying to let you think about it, or give you what I think about it. Go ahead, Ian.
Not to throw a monkey wrench in, but my translation does have it capitalized.
Well, your translation's wrong. Let's go on to the next question. Notice I didn't even ask her which one it was either. I just labeled it. Okay, well that's interesting. Thank you, because I didn't look at all of them. So that argument goes out the window then. If some have it and some don't, because you might refer to any judge in a formal way. So any other thoughts? We're fishing here a little bit. Because it could be Jesus, right? It could be God. But my gut tells me, just in my understanding of this, if you start battling one another and you start bringing charges against one another, be careful, because the judgment that's wrought towards others may turn right back around and bring judgment against you. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Who said that? Jesus did. Right? That's what text? Yeah, what? Matthew 7, right? That's Matthew 7. Judge not that ye be not judged. For what judgment ye made against others will be judged back, right? And then that whole conversation about pull the speck or get the beam out of your own eye before you reach for the speck in another person's eye. That whole discussion in Matthew 7 is about proper judgment. That, to me, seems to be what James is driving at here. Be careful that you don't get this back and forth behavior going, because what in one moment might condemn another might come right back. Behold, the judgment be standing there at the door waiting for you the next time, if you're behaving in the very same way. Rather, he says, take my brethren the prophets who have spoken in the name of the Lord for an example of suffering, affliction, and of patience. By whose hand had the prophets suffered? Okay, and by human hands, right? By the behaviors and reactions of an Israelite nation who didn't want to what? Didn't want to believe it, didn't want to hear it, right? Did not want to be responsive to God's messaging through the prophets. So James warns the rich. He tells the oppressed to be patient. The reason to be patient is because God's bringing judgment that is nigh. Be careful not to fight fire with fire, because what might condemn another might turn right back around and condemn you. The judge is right there standing at the door, waiting to address your faults, just like he is the other guy's faults. So rather than do that, he says, how about let's learn from the prophets instead? Let's look at them, James says. Who did the work of whom? God. They spoke, who have spoken in the name of the Lord. It's interesting, right? Because James looks at a general audience of believers who had not necessarily any specific role or function, like the prophets had. And yet he says, the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord, these were men who had very specific, important roles and purposes. And yet what happened to them? They suffered affliction and had to be patient while being mistreated and not addressed appropriately, even though they were the voice and messaging of the Lord. If the prophets who had specific function and purpose and role in the purposes of God had to be patient, so do we, and so do they, that James is writing to. Let's learn patience from people who really had to experience. Behold, we count. I'm sorry, go ahead, Bob.
We're talking about Jesus being the judge, which I think it is, because back in verse 8 there, it says he is coming soon. So that's a definite reference to Christ coming back. So this judgment has to be the final judgment, like it says in Corinthians 15. All will not sleep, but all will be changed. So I'm of the opinion that this has to be the final judgment.
And I'm not, and I disagree with you, but I'm not going to argue with you about it. And I'm not, and again, maybe, right? I struggle fitting that to the narrative. And that's the only reason why I said what I said. Because I don't, how does it help them be patient for something that still to this day hasn't even occurred?
Because, like it's a reference to the farmer, you plant your seed and then you got to be patient and wait for the crops to produce.
Right.
Okay? The seed has been planted. Christ is coming back, so you got to be patient for when he comes back.
Yeah.
And he is the judge here.
And I agree that principle is true. And it may be true here. You know what I mean? It may be true here. That's not what I saw in the text. I still struggle with that phrase, the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. That seems to be a more imminent, not something 2,000 years plus later. But
we're in the last days.
Yeah, and he used that phrase earlier, as it matters. And it may very well be, right? I'm not arguing that it can't be. I'm just food for thought as to why I led to where I was. But I'm not arguing with you at all. That you can see that. Go ahead, Barr.
Well, if you look at another scene where there is a judgment call by the Lord, that would be when he's addressing the 7 churches in the book of Revelation, and he says, straighten up your act or I'm taking out your candle.
Yeah.
And you see, that's not waiting for the final judgment.
Right.
That is the here now.
And in fairness to all that, that is the challenge with this. Because when you start trying to make comparisons, which one compares to which one? Right? Because some are referencing the end of all things, and some are not. And the same exact language used for both is found, and sometimes it isn't as obvious as we'd like it to be of which comparison is happening. Are we a 1 Corinthians issue here, or are we a Revelation issue here? Are we, you know what I mean? And it's not always as clear.
You're more or less saying that the judgment that we're talking about here is death.
No, not necessarily. I believe the judgment could just simply be that those who have been causing oppression will find consequence and end the oppression.
Well, I was using death as a time. Once you die, your judgment is sealed.
Well, I agree with that. And again, I don't know that James is teaching that. I would agree with that based on other texts, if that makes sense to you. I don't know that I don't see that in James. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I don't see that here. I see it in other texts and believe what you said is true. I'm just not sure that's the path James is on. That's the only argument I'm making here. Go ahead, Jeff.
Earlier, there where you're talking about holding a grudge, you know, Matthew 5, Jesus said that we're to love our enemy. And then you go to Romans chapter 12, where it says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I shall recompense. And then he goes on to say that we heap hot coals upon our enemy, not by actually heaping hot coals or doing evil to them, but by doing good.
By the right behaviors.
And you mentioned a point there about getting even, that's right. Our enemies have done evil, they're down here, and when we do evil, we get even all right. We go right
we
down
come right
with
back
them
with
into the pit.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's why it's up to us to do good to our enemies so that we can be like Christ and be the example of him.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate, and by the way, the Bible says that iron sharpens iron, right? And that's what I love about Bible class, is it allows us to sharpen each other and challenge each other a little bit. And that's not a bad thing. I think sometimes we get into a mindset of, well, let's just say what we think it is and let's move on. But no, I appreciate all the questions, because that's what we're doing together here. And I feel better when I hear that because that means you all are reading and thinking and looking at it, and I appreciate. I'm just trying to illustrate that I appreciate that about these kinds of discussions, even though we might have to sort at times what page we're on. All right, so behold, he said, verse 11, we count them happy which do what? Okay, so look to the prophets for your example. Let's not recompense evil for evil. And basically, James says, we have always elevated individuals who have demonstrated great endurance and patience. And who's he point to? Greatest example of all, right? He points to what we would define probably as the most obvious of all examples of those who have endured patiently and endured patiently and endured patiently throughout tremendous hardships. You've heard of the patience of Job, but not only have you heard the bad side of the story, but you've also seen the what? You've seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. Job lost everything, but regained multiple more than he had to start. You see the Lord reward. And by the way, I would, from a generic standpoint, that does kind of fit the picture of eternal judgment, right? That fits that description, where the patient endurance of whatever we've gone through in this temporary world is very easily and quickly forgotten because of the eternal benefits and blessings that we experience on the other side. And what I love about James here is he's saying, here, you don't have to wait. In other words, you don't have to wait to experience heaven to know this is true, because we can point to men like Job, who endured patiently through some pretty tremendous trials, and on the other side of that, we witness the mercy and the kindness and the compassion of the Lord in his efforts to help Job through that. And so we have all the evidence we need to know that patience works, and joy can return, and happiness can return, because the Lord is pitiful and full of tender mercy. And that's important concept for us to appreciate.
The farmer waits for the harvest through the earth, and now we're talking about Job, the same thing. Job suffered, and he waited, and he got rewarded.
Yeah. And during the wait, it wasn't easy. He had questions. He had things to work through, challenges to face.
That's what supports your thought.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jeff.
I think it goes back to earlier when James talked about if you humble yourself before the Lord, he will lift you up. And again, this idea of being patient requires humility. You know, to understand that God's going to do things in His time and His way.
Yeah.
And when you do that, God, and if you're true to God and trust in His time and His way and remain faithful, things will come out good for you in the other side.
Yeah. All right, so somebody tell me what verse 12 has to do with any of these things we've been talking about. And if you're shaking your head, I got no idea. You're right with me, right? Maybe, but let's talk about the thought first. But above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by the earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea and your nay, nay, lest ye fall into condemnation. So, go ahead, Laura, I'm sorry.
To do with the grumbling that we're doing?
Okay, so it could have had to do with this grumbling and complaining issues that he's trying to address, and he's trying to get them to just simplify, right? And not begrudge each other, but just be honest. And so there's a connectivity there.
Going back to the other things that he was talking about, you know, how these landowners were defrauding their people and all that stuff. And then they get their toes stepped on and they say, I swear I'll change, I swear I'll do better. And instead of saying that, just, you know, let your yes be yes, let your no be no. In other words, action speaking louder than words.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Because if you say, I swear I'm going to do better, and then you keep putting it off, then there comes your condemnation.
Right. And I think you're right. The connectivity may be to the fact that here are the rich that he's describing here in chapter 5 that have found interesting ways to defraud and to cheat and to deny what is rightfully due others. And James goes to whom, by the way? Where did he get this? Again, that came from Jesus, right? Jesus, when he dealt with the Pharisees, he had an issue with some hypocritical oaths they were making. What were the problem that, if you recall that scene, what were they doing? That if they swore on the temple, that didn't mean anything. You could make an oath on the temple and not honor it, and they didn't care. But if you made an oath on the gold of the temple, now that's got value. You gotta live by that oath, right? And he gave some other illustrations. And his ultimate conclusion out of all that is stop the nonsense and just let your yes be yes and your no be no. And that's probably the connectivity here. He's looking at this audience on both sides, really, and just says, listen, enough of all the odd ways that you entreat and deal with one another. No more making oaths and swearing by this and swearing by that and calculating the value of that oath based on the monetary value of the item that you swore on. How about let's just let yes be yes and no be no? And wouldn't the world just be fantastic? Wouldn't our world just be fantastic if that's all it took was just knowing that when somebody said yes, that's what it meant, and when someone said no, that's what it meant, and not all of the silliness that happens so often in circumstances and situations. And I believe that's what James is just kind of getting them back. And by the way, it's important for us to note that on multiple occasions in the book of James here, he points to Jesus. You know, he doesn't just tell them about how they should behave like Jesus would want them to behave. He actually goes to the very messaging and teachings of Jesus when it comes to how to entreat one another, when it comes to let your yes be yes and no be no. You know, all these various things that you could point right back to the very teachings of Jesus and go, this is what the Lord wants. And James is just trying to compel them to live by that and allow that to be their determination and their practice as well.
The Lord is telling us just be honest.
Yeah. such a simple principle of why it's so hard for folks to want to honor and respect is difficult at times.
Patient.
Yeah.
Be patient. Don't be, I swear I'm not gonna do it again.
Yeah.
That's having patience, think it through before you say yes.
Yeah.
You know, that's patience.
Yeah, and I
We're told not to speak quick.
yeah. Yeah, he taught that in this text, didn't he? That's a great example, Will, where James even talked about slow to speak, slow to anger, slow to wrath, right? Be patient, think it through, make wise decisions, let your yes be yes, no be no. And that's important. Appreciate all the thoughts, questions this morning. Lord willing, we'll come back and we'll wrap up the book of James most likely on Wednesday. I kind of know where I'm going next, but I'm not quite willing to tell you yet.